a member of the Judiciary Committee in the U.S. Senate, then as Ohio Attorney General, now as Governor. I've had ample reason to think about this issue over the last 50-plus years. During my time as an assistant prosecutor and then as the elected county prosecuting attorney, I prosecuted no death penalty cases. For a significant part of my time in that office, Ohio's death penalty law had been declared unconstitutional. However, my time as a prosecutor was very impactful. It was my first opportunity to work with victims of horrific crimes such as rape, homicide, and to see firsthand how devastating these crimes are to the victims and to their families. In 1980, when I was elected to the Ohio State Senate, Ohio had no death penalty law. When I was appointed to the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, we quickly started working on a new death penalty law that we hoped would conform to U.S. Supreme Court decisions. I was a co-sponsor of Senate Bill 1, a bill to reinstitute Ohio's death penalty. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I participated in the markup of the bill and the debate surrounding it. The State Senate passed the bill on June 30th, 1981, by a vote of 23 to 10. I voted in favor of it. It was then sent to the House, which passed it the next day by a vote of 71 to 28. Governor Rhodes signed it into law, and it took effect on October 19th, 1981. It was a bipartisan bill. At the time, the Republicans controlled the state Senate. Democrats controlled the state House of Representatives. It may be of interest that in the state Senate version of the capital punishment bill that we passed in 1981, the jury was given the option of choosing life without parole. The House version did not give the jury this option, and the House version ultimately prevailed. While a member of the United States House of Representatives, I worked on and voted for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, which President Ronald Reagan signed into law. That bill expanded the number of crimes eligible for the federal death penalty. While a member of the United States Senate, I also worked on and voted for the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which President Bill Clinton signed into law in 1996. Now, among other things, this law attempted to speed up the review of capital punishment cases in our federal courts, all in an effort to shorten the lengthy appeals process in these cases. Years later, as Ohio Attorney General, I vigorously carried out my legal obligation to defend our capital punishment laws and to litigate in court for the executions. Some examples include the following. First, getting Ohio's death penalty protocol reinstated by the Federal Court of Appeals. Getting Ohio's death penalty restarted after a prior moratorium. Defending death penalty convictions in the United States Supreme Court and in the Ohio Supreme Court. And seeking and obtaining death penalty indictments and death sentences on multiple occasions by the Special Prosecution Section under my direction and authority as Ohio Attorney General. Further, as part of the Attorney General's standard practice, I talked with a number of victims' family members by phone prior to each execution. When I voted for the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1981, I believed that in some cases, capital punishment could serve as a deterrent to keep some people from killing. For me, it was the moral justification for having a death penalty. In judging whether capital punishment is a deterrent, two things are very important. Two words: certainty and swiftness. Certainty and swiftness. By certainty, I mean, what is the certainty that it will be carried out, that it will actually happen? How likely is it that a murderer will be indicted for a capital offense, convicted of the capital offense, and then actually executed. Swiftness. By swiftness, we mean how long does it actually take from sentencing to execution. It would seem that if the death penalty were an actual deterrent for some people, it would need to happen swiftly, quickly, and with certainty. However, statistically, the odds of the death penalty actually being carried out are very low. And if it is carried out, it is all but guaranteed that it will take a long, long time for that execution to happen. Let's examine the issue of swiftness and look at the data to see how long it is taking for executions to be carried out in the state of Ohio. Now, I think the best way to see how long it's taking is to look at the last 10 people to be executed in Ohio and see how long it took from the time of conviction to the time of execution. The elapsed time between sentencing and execution ranged from a low of 14 years to a high of 32 years. 14 to 32 is the range. For the last 10 people in Ohio who were sentenced to death and who were actually executed, the average, by that I mean the mean, the average elapsed time was 21 years. This statistic omits the people who died waiting to be executed. It also omits those whose cases were overturned by a court. Let's look at the numbers. Of the 337 individuals who received a death sentence since 1981, 56 have been executed. In that same time, 41 died of either natural causes or by suicide while on death row. And, according to the Ohio Attorney General's most recent annual death penalty report, since 1981, a total of 89 death sentences were removed based on, quote, judicial action, end of quote. In the Ohio Attorney General's 2024 annual report, he explains what he means by judicial action. He says that, and I quote, most were removed because of legal errors, such as ineffective assistance of counsel, Brady violations, juror errors, or appellate determinations that the aggravating circumstances of the crime did not outweigh the mitigating factors beyond a reasonable doubt, end of quote. Excluding the last 7+ years, we now have 4 decades of experience with the death penalty in the state of Ohio. Ohio attorneys general for decades have had specialized lawyers who work diligently and exclusively on these cases. They do everything they can to speed up the process. But despite their best efforts, and despite the work of Congress to speed things along, we still have in Ohio an extremely long waiting period between sentencing and execution. Further, these long delays have occurred in spite of the best efforts of the law enforcement departments that investigated the cases, the prosecutors who prosecuted the cases, and the judges and juries who decided the cases. They did the best they could do. The truth is that there is no prospect that these long delays will be substantially changed in the future. Now, I think it's significant to note that Ohio is not an outlier in this regard. Ohio ranks in the middle of the states in the average number of years between sentencing and execution. So this is clearly not a problem unique to Ohio. With a more than 2-decade-long wait time, the threat of the death penalty today is simply not a deterrent. Let's now look at the lack of certainty in whether people sentenced to death are ever actually executed. Let's look at this since the death penalty's reinstatement in 1981. I want you to now have a chart up. So let's turn to this chart. This chart shows how often people have been indicted for the death penalty per year. Take it one step at a time. Indicted. As you can see, there's been a dramatic drop over the last 4 decades in the number of people indicted each year. The blue line shows indictments. The red line shows convictions. The gray line shows actual executions. Now, let's turn to how often the death penalty was actually handed down in those cases. This chart shows the number of death penalty sentences from 1982 to the present. Even excluding the last 7+ years, since its inception in October 1981, the number of capital crime convictions has steadily gone down decade after decade after decade. After the death penalty was reinstated on October 19, 1981, counting the first year as 1982, through the remainder of that decade, Ohio averaged 14.25 death penalty sentences each year. In the 1990s, we averaged 13.6 death penalty sentences per year. In the 2000s, for that decade, we averaged a little over 5 death penalty sentences per year. In the 2010s, we averaged fewer than 4 death penalty sentences per year, and the 6 years of the 2020s, we've only had a total of 2 people sentenced to death. Now, just for historical reference, please note that in 1995, juries were given the option of life without parole. The first full year that was in effect was 1996. So let's look again at the bar graph to show the frequency of the death penalty being handed down per year since its reinstitution in 1982. It is clear from this data that the certainty of the death penalty being applied has steadily gone down over the years. The odds of a murderer being indicted for a capital offense are dramatically less today. And even if actually indicted for a capital offense, the odds of them being sentenced to death are even more remote. Now let's look again at just those who have been sentenced to death. Of the 337 people sentenced to death, 41 died of either natural causes or by suicide. 89 were taken off death row by a court or courts. Only 56 have been executed. So even if the murderer is caught, indicted, convicted, and sentenced to death, the odds are still pretty good they're not going to be executed. And so with the dramatic drop in people being executed and the over 2-decade wait time for those who actually are executed, it is today hard to make the case for the death penalty being a deterrent. Former Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections Director Reginald Wilkinson served from 1991 until 2006. During that time, he supervised the execution of 20 men. He has written the following about deterrence, and I quote, "The claim the death penalty is not a deterrent to crime, particularly murder, is supported by a significant body of research and analysis. Many studies, including a report from the National Research Council, have concluded that there is no reliable evidence that the death penalty reduces crime rates more effectively than other forms of punishment," end of quote. Now let me turn to a couple other things that I want to talk about having to do with the death penalty. One should not and cannot discuss capital punishment without thinking of the victims' families. I do not pretend to even be able to imagine how the family of a murder victim feels. However, we do know that these crimes are horrendous, and they must be gut-wrenching for the victims' families. The murderers have permanently taken away from them their loved one. The recitation of the facts of the crime must bring about for all Ohioans horror, disgust, and great anger. We know anecdotally that many of the victims' family members want to see the convicted killer executed. We also know that some family members of victims do not want to see an execution. Some of them have expressed their belief that the victim would not have wanted to have the execution take place. Others have said they do not want the execution for religious reasons. Each victim's family members react differently. But one feeling, however, that seems to be universally held by victims' families is that the long, long wait to see if the death penalty is carried out is frustrating and very hurtful for these victims' families. We also cannot talk about capital punishment without talking about those we task with carrying it out. While it is true they are volunteers, we still must be mindful of the impact preparations for and the carrying out of executions have on them. They are the forgotten people, but they are real people, and they are our fellow Ohioans. Gary Moore served as the director of the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections from 2011 until 2018. During that time, he supervised 15 executions. He summarizes the toll on the staff in this one sentence, and I quote, "The heaviness felt by the execution team and by the support staff is indescribable," end of quote. Moore points out that there are many people involved in preparing for, practicing for, and carrying out an execution. Moore describes the first group of staff this way, and I quote, "The first group of staff dedicated to the execution process are those staff that are assigned each day to supervise, feed, address the needs of those on death row. Staff include correctional security staff, nurses, case managers, chaplains, and facility supervisors," end of quote. Moore points out that many of these staff members see and supervise these death row inmates daily, and some for many years, and that some of the people closest to the execution process believe that we are not executing the worst of the worst. Again, according to Gary Moore, and I quote, "As the death row inmates were taken from death row to be transferred to Southern Ohio Correctional Facility the day before the execution, these staff would tell me about the positive things that they observed the death row inmates doing, like teaching other death row inmates to read or talking to other inmates through family crisis." Moore continues, "Staff would ask me, why them? And how is it fair that these inmates were to be executed while others who have killed in prison or killed multiple people or law enforcement and pose a chronic threat to staff and security are not executed," end of quote. Then there's the execution team, as well as all the dozens of support staff who are needed. Before the execution team must practice. During Director Moore's time as director, the federal judge required 4 separate practices. Listen again to Director Moore, and I quote, "A team member served in the role of the person being executed. That person experienced everything the condemned would experience except for inserting the needles into the vein. The person experienced being secured in the cell, being walked to the death chamber by the team, lying on the gurney with their body strapped to the gurney, both arms being strapped to the boards next to the gurney, and laying there for the entire time it would take to complete the protocol." Moore continues, "On my first execution, I played, it was not play, the role of the condemned. As the process concluded, the team called for the medical staff to respond as I was experiencing extreme anxiety symptoms. Other team members in that role had similar experiences," end of quote. After the actual execution, the execution team is still not finished. Some may be called into federal court to justify how they carried out the execution. According to Director Moore, and I quote again, "As intense as each execution was, the execution team members had to be prepared for their testimony for hours prior to federal court hearings. Preparing to testify brought back all the feelings associated with ending a person's life," end of quote. Former director continues, "These staff carrying out one of the most challenging public service responsibilities were given little respect by opposing counsel attempting to discredit their work," end of quote. It is clear that the death penalty is being handed down much less frequently than it was when that law was first passed in 1981. In fact, the decline has been steady in each decade. Further, the wait time between sentencing and execution for those who don't die first or have a court intervene for them has remained very, very long, and with no indication at all that that will change. In summary, each decade that the death penalty has been in effect, the chances of a murderer getting executed get more and more and more remote. The conclusion I draw from all of this is that it is today impossible to make the case that the death penalty is a deterrent. I no longer believe the death penalty is a deterrent to murder. The moral justification I had for voting for the death penalty simply no longer exists. For the state to take a human life, there must, in my opinion, there must be evidence that in doing so, it will help protect the public, that the threat of that action will deter someone from committing murder. For the reasons stated above, I do not believe that argument today can be successfully made. Nor do I believe that there's any chance in the future the facts that I have cited to support that belief will change. Therefore, I believe Ohio should abolish the death penalty. The legislature can take this action, and I believe they should take this action. If the legislature does not want to make that decision, they can leave it up to a vote of the people of the state of Ohio. Throughout my career, I've always stated that the most important way to protect the public is to lock up violent criminals and to keep them out of society, keep them locked up. That is a proven way of saving lives and protecting our citizens. Our money and our energies are much better spent focusing on keeping these repeat violent offenders out of society than focusing on the death penalty. Any decision to officially end the death penalty in Ohio could not change the horror and the anger that we all feel in regard to these murderers, nor the deep sorrow we feel for the victims and for their families. We cannot sanitize this decision. These murderers ended the life of a precious human being. These murderers have changed the lives of the surviving family members forever. Their lives will never be the same.